I call Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to take a call on the second reading of the Border Processing Arrivals and Departures Levy Bill as it scurries its way urgently through the House. In the absence of a select committee process, Mr Speaker, this or any other mechanism come to that of public scrutiny, it appears all we have left as a means for ascertaining the reasons behind this bill and for getting some kind of answers out of the government is this process of urgency. And the first question that I want to ask, and I have to say, Mr Speaker, that I'm a little hurt that Minister Wagner addressed everyone's questions except mine. I mean, I'm not taking it personally, it's just, I want to know why. Maybe they were questions that the Minister felt she couldn't answer. Maybe they cut too deeply to the heart of the matter. But anyway, I'm sure the Minister will take the opportunity to address the concerns that we have as a party. Mr Speaker, the first question I have is, we've been given an indication that this levy, fee, tax, whatever we want to call it, is going to be added onto the cost of tickets. And that'll be tickets that are sold here going outwards and tickets that are purchased overseas coming inwards. What I want to know, Mr Speaker, from the government is at what stage of the GST process does this levy get applied? Does this levy get applied before GST is added or after? Is it in fact going to have GST on it as well? And is it going to be another tax upon a tax? In the same way that tax on rates is a GST on rates is a tax on a tax. And this is another case of what happens in terms of unintended consequences, or perhaps actually they are intended consequences, Mr Speaker. When due process is done away with and things happen in a hurry, and there isn't the time for reflection and contemplation and consideration and questions being asked and answered. Maybe this is one of these things that will just get sorted out later. I mean, if they don't want to make it a tax upon a tax and add GST onto the levy, well, then there's going to have to be a whole lot more administration involved, and that's going to raise the cost as well. And so the value of the levy itself is going to fall. Unless, of course, they don't mind adding a tax on a tax. But this we will find out, I suppose, at some stage in the future. What's really starting to coalesce as being the centre point, I guess, of our difficulty with this bill is that we don't know whether this levy is intended to be additional funding for biosecurity or whether it is actually intended to just replace existing funding. Now, Mr McKelvey, in his long, rambling speech of about 30 seconds, I think it was, spoke of a boost to biosecurity funding. But the Minister has consistently talked about cost recovery. Well, it's one or the other. You know, it's either an additional source of funding or it's a switch in funding from one source to another. And I have a horrible suspicion, it's growing on me all the time, Mr Speaker, that in fact this levy, which is touted as being a boost and an increase for biosecurity, is in fact smoke and mirrors, and that actually funding allocated to biosecurity will be flatlined, and it's just the source of it that will change. Because when you drill down through the mud of the government's budget figures, Mr Speaker, it seems that all the appropriations relating to what used to be vote biosecurity and now appears to go by a number of different names are either flat or slightly reduced. So there is a one-off capital injection to fund new X-ray machines. We see that. Whether that's actually funded by the levy or tax or not remains to be seen. And there's a mention of some additional staff, but that comes in some of the government's publicity material and not actually in the bill itself. And again, there's no clear indication as to whether the ongoing funding for these things, for the additional staff and for the X-ray machines, will be coming solely from the levy or partly from the levy, or whether the existing baseline funding from general taxation will continue or not and the levy will be on top. This we actually need to know. Last year, I think it was, Mr Speaker, we passed the Airports Cost Recovery Act. And airports where that levy applies will not also have the new levy. And that, to my mind, Mr Speaker, adds weight to the idea that this levy tax, as it's being suggested, is intended to be the primary source of funding for border inspection activities and not an additional source. So, cargo inspection, as we know, containers coming in and freight, is already funded through levies and fees. But we also know that only about 1 in 4, only about 25% of incoming shipping containers are actually inspected. And I'd like to see increases in this levy as well, if indeed the passenger levy funding is to be additional to existing revenue. And the Customs website advertises inspection fees for containers for the importation of personal household effects, $330 for a 20-foot container, up to $480 for a 40-foot, plus fumigation if necessary. So that's for the likes of, excuse me, people migrating to New Zealand or New Zealanders who've been away coming home, their personal effects and so forth. And so we know that all these containers are inspected because that fee is charged and paid and there's a devanning process. But the great majority of containers, general freight, are not inspected. There's an audit process where some are taken out or there'll be a period of time or certain ports.
Passenger levy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So they're not inspected. There are not enough inspectors and I'm wondering whether any of this levy is to be directed to that sort of thing. We'd actually like to see a levy extended for that. So, Mr Speaker, that's a large barn door which is being left open. Our other primary concern is whether or not this levy is simply in fact a holiday tax. And it gets back to my earlier questions around whether or not, getting back to whether this is an additional stream of funding or a replacement stream of funding. Because, Mr Speaker, I don't believe that the travelling public would mind too much about paying $16 to come into the country if it was on top of their air tickets, if that was going to contribute to additional safety in terms of making sure that New Zealand doesn't get diseases like foot and mouth and so forth. And we would certainly expect, I think the New Zealand travelling public would certainly expect that overseas travellers would pay that as well. And the primary sector certainly expects that that any person who is a source of potential risk will pay their fair share. And it's fairness and the relative fairness of who is expected to pay what, Mr Speaker, which is at the heart of this matter. So we would like some clarity around that. But it's puzzling as to why we'd be charging a $6 levy for people to leave the country. Now, I know the Minister has explained that this is to add to or cover the costs of customs for people on the way out. Customs and biosecurity we know are two different things. But again, it makes me suspicious that if we are going to charge a levy on passengers leaving the country, paying $6 towards the cost of running the customs service, that to me says very loud and clear that actually this is a replacement source of revenue, not an additional source of revenue. Well, and I'd love the Minister to stand up in the committee stage and spell this out quite clearly as to, I want an assurance from the Minister that this levy is going to be on top of existing baseline taxation funding for biosecurity and customs, not instead of, because there's just too much ambiguity about it. And the way they're spinning this thing as being great and marvellous and wonderful and additional, maybe I'm naturally a suspicious person, Mr Speaker, but it seems to me as if what we're going to wind up with at the end of this whole process is the same amount of money coming from a different place and not actually an increase. And actually most of the bill, Mr Speaker, is concerned with who collects the money and what trust accounts it goes in and what records need to be kept and what penalties will apply if these rules and conditions are broken. And it actually doesn't say anything at all about what the money will actually be spent on, other than government statements around funding for biosecurity, which itself is a welcome thing. The explanatory note states that the objective of the bill is to ensure that funding arrangements for MPI and customs are sustainable and the costs associated with the delivery of those activities are borne by those who directly benefit from the activities or give rise to the risks. So, I mean, costs being borne by those who directly benefit. Well, in terms of customs, Minister, I don't understand that because arguably the only direct beneficiary from a customs inspection will be customs itself. And while the entire nation benefits from biosecurity inspections, the primary sector could arguably be called the primary beneficiary from biosecurity, and they're not being targeted by the levy at all. Now, I'm not saying that they should carry more of the cost. The primary sector pays tax, and tax currently pays for biosecurity. But they're actually not. They are a direct beneficiary, and yet this levy appears to be targeting a group who are not a direct beneficiary, which again is confusing. The descriptions in the Act itself talk about functions. Okay, I guess functions can mean anything. We'd like a bit of that spelled out a bit more clearly. I have another question, Mr Speaker. Do cruise ship passengers get to pay the exit and entry levies 4 times over if, for example, their cruise ship stops in Auckland and in Wellington and in Littleton and at Port Chalmers? Because if the ship goes outside the 12-mile limit, arguably, the passenger has left New Zealand and then come back in again and gone out and come back in and gone out and come back in. Do they get stung with a fee every time they leave and every time they arrive again? Well, why have we not been told these things? And again, look, there's no mention of whether or not this additional or altered source of funding is going to be used to reinstate 100% screening of all incoming passengers, luggage, mail and freight. And this is something that we're quite hot on, Mr Speaker. It's something that will actually make a material difference. rearranging the beans into different size heaps before you count them doesn't actually increase the number of beans. And so, again, Mr. Speaker, we have questions which Jack and the Beanstalk.
I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but his time has expired.